Welcome to the Helping Families Be Happy podcast, where we explore the often messy world of family, love, and relationships. I'm your host for this podcast, Adina Oberman, a mom, former preschool teacher, picture book lover, and member of the Familius marketing team. I'm also the creator of Big Books for Little Hands, a site dedicated to connecting parents and teachers with the best books for the ups and downs of life with young children. We welcome today's guest, Sara Gundell. Sara has been an avid book blogger since 2010, featuring a range of books, including children's, young adult, and adult romance, and currently focuses on sharing books through her Instagram account, Novel Novice. She is a passionate, lifelong reader and believes in fostering a love of reading by letting kids read what they want. Sara previously served on the Associate Board for Smart Reading, an early childhood literacy program in the state of Oregon, and is an active Little Free Library steward. She lives in the Portland, Oregon area with her husband and their 4-year-old twins. This episode aligns with the Familius habits: read together and talk together. You can learn more about the Familius 10 Habits of Happy Families by going to the Habit Hub blog on Familius.com. Welcome, Sara. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Can you tell us a little bit about your blog and Novel Novice and how you got started?
Yeah, so story time, we have to go back to, I think it was 2007, 2008-ish. And I was very involved, well, maybe not involved, but into fandom for a book series called Twilight by Stephanie Meyer. I'm dating myself. And I heard about a website called Novel Novice Twilight that was started by a teacher in, I want to say, the Virginia area. Her name is Tiffany Truitt. And she started her blog as a way to chronicle how she had started using the Twilight books in her middle school classroom to engage her students. And she had had wild success using those books to engage her kids. She taught at a school that had a reputation for being, quote unquote, difficult to teach. And when she started, she noticed the kids sneaking the books under their desk and decided, well, if my kids are so into this book, my kids who don't normally read, that they're sneaking it in class, I need to know what it's about. And so she set aside her kind of, bookish snobbery to pick up these books and was like, oh, I get it. And so she started keeping the books in her classroom. She made them available to all her students. Even the boys were like sneaking them. And so she started using it to incorporate the required curriculum and use them to teach the curriculum required for the state testing and all of the requirements. And her kids had amazing test scores that year. And they did so well. So she used the blog to chronicle how she was using them to great success in her classroom. And I just loved that. I loved the idea of using something kids were into to get them engaged in the required curriculum. And it really resonated with me. I remembered when I was in high school, I was super into the show X-Files. And I remember I had very indulgent teachers who would, when I came to them and said, hey, we're learning about, for example, Frankenstein, the book by Mary Shelley. And there's this episode of the X-Files, which is a show I love, that's based on that book. Can we watch it in school, in class, and talk about it? And my very indulgent teacher said, sure, okay. And it got me engaged with a book that otherwise I thought was kind of boring. And I had other teachers who did that for me as well. And it just made such a big impact on me. And so I really kind of recognized that same attitude with what Tiffany was doing on her website. I found out about her blog because another Twilight fan site had talked about it. And she started getting more attention and she was like, I think I need help. And at the time I was single, working a graveyard shift, and I had free time. And I was like, I'll help. And so that's how I got involved with her website. And then it kind of just spun out of there. The Twilight fandom was really exploding with the movies coming out. And it kind of snowballed and was getting away from itself. And after a couple of years, I kind of sat down and was like, I'd really like to get back to where this started, which was the books. But let's talk about some more books because you can only reread Twilight so many times before you want something new to read. So with Tiffany's blessing, I took the Novel Novice name and created my own website, novelnovice.com, which started as a place to talk about the YA books that kids and teens wanted to read and whenever possible tie it into the books and lessons they were required to learn in school, whether it was other literature or history, science. And I'm not a teacher, but I loved identifying where you could tie in lessons that they teach in school to the popular YA books that were coming out. And this was, 2010, when YA was really just exploding onto the scene. So that is how I got my start in book blogging. And it just kind of snowballed from there over the years. And, at the time I was really passionate about reading YA. My reading and tastes have evolved a little bit over the years. I read a lot of adult romance right now. That's what satisfies my reading, tastes these days. But I also read a lot of picture books because I have 4-year-old twins, as you mentioned. So, I retired the website blog a few years ago just for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is life got busy. Um, but I still have my Instagram account, my Bookstagram, and that's just a fun space for me. I really like being creative and taking pictures. I like having a space to talk about books. And so these days I focus on talking about the books I'm reading and the books I'm reading with my kids. The algorithm hates it because I'm talking about really spicy adult romances and then picture books for 4-year-olds on any given day. But it's my little corner of the internet, and it makes me happy, and so that's what I do these days.
I ask you questions about so many different things that you talked about in your story. I think a lot of what you said will resonate with a lot of our listeners because so many of them are parents and have, shared with us their journey, their reading journey as it's evolved along with their parenting journey.
Mhm.
But I think I want to start with talking about how you have done what so many teachers and so many parents try to do, which is to find the interests of their kids or their students and use that to open up worlds. And you've done that. I think this is such an important conversation because I think, especially living in a post pandemic world, there's a
Mhm.
lot of emphasis on how our kids are doing in school and the this phenomenon of loss of learning post COVID about how our children might be in school, where their academic levels are now, as opposed to where they might have been if we hadn't had, Zoom school or no school at all,
Yeah.
and COVID restrictions. And I think that what you're promoting in helping people find ways for their kids to learn through their interests is so important because how are we going to how are we going to motivate kids to read? Are we going to just give them more reading time? Or are we going to just make them sit at their desks longer? That's not going to work. What's going to work is giving them stuff that they want to read. So I always like to say to people when they ask about, like, well, what level is your child reading at, where should they be reading? And I always say, like, that, the teachers are the experts on, levels and what's appropriate, what the expectations are for each grade level and all that. But when you're at the library with your child or a bookstore or, picking out reading material, start with what they're interested in. If they're interested in sports, get them some, pick out some sports books from the library. If they're interested in reading about their favorite sport and they're reading that 20 minutes a night or half an hour a night that they're required, that's a win. Um, Even if it's a sports magazine, they're still reading.
Reading.
Yeah, I've had many when I was a preschool teacher, I had parents saying that, well, they're reading like a board book that's for babies, or they just want to keep reading the same book over and over again. And I'm thinking, if they want to read, follow that interest. It could be a magazine. If they're really interested in crafting, see if you can grab some crafting theme magazines from your local library. And if your kid's reading it, that's wonderful. Like they have found their motivation to read.
Yeah.
Um, Graphic novels. I'm so tired of hearing people complain about their kids reading graphic novels.
Reading
There's
is
so many
reading.
wonderful things.
Yeah.
Yes, as long as
I
they're
always,
reading.
I always think about the fact that, like, think about, take it away from kids for a second. Talk about how many adults will tell you, oh, I don't like to read. Well, the problem isn't that you don't like to read. The problem is you haven't found the right books. I mean, and that's always kind of been, going back to my early novel novice days, it was, you know, there was a big discourse among book bloggers for a while at a time about, whether it was acceptable to post negative book reviews. And I don't need to get into that argument because I think it's acceptable for a book blogger to post an honest review if they wanted a book. My policy was to never post negative book reviews. And it was not because I wanted the publishers to like me, quote unquote, but it was because I didn't want to yuck someone's yum. I wasn't going to talk poorly about a book that could be the book for some kid. Because even if I didn't like it, if it's the book that gets a kid to read, I'm not going to diss it. That's really important. And I think, adults who don't read just haven't found the right books for them. There's so much snobbery amongst adults about, what constitutes real literature or real books, and I say this as someone who reads romance, which is a often, criticized category of books because it's written primarily for women by women, and it's not literary, quote unquote. You know what? Screw that. Can I say that? Like,
Yes.
books are books, and books serve so many different purposes. I read because I enjoy it. It's an escape. It's entertainment, and I find it very satisfying. I find it very soothing. It's books got me through some really hard times. I am so grateful to be a mom to two little kids, but that did not come easily to me. I went through a lot. I had pregnancy losses. I had infertility treatments, and that was really, really hard. I mean, that's part of how I found the romance genre is I needed books that were happy and joyful and ended happily. I didn't want to pick up a book and have it end terribly. And, the hallmark of the romance genre is it ends with a happily ever after. And I needed that guaranteed happily ever after. And that's how I found romance books. It got me through some of the most terrible times of my life. And now I just like it because it's joyful. The world is a terrible place with terrible things happening in it. So I don't need to read about that. And so I think, even adults need to find the books that make them happy to read. And I apply the same thing to my kids,
Yeah.
read what makes you happy.
That's such an excellent point. I think that there is kind of this feeling of like you have to be reading the latest the latest thing that came out, or you have to be sort of on trend with what other people are reading.
Mhm.
And I think it's such an important thing to just read what you like, and also what you're doing is good for you, so you're modeling that self-care for your family. But also modeling coping strategies. We all have ways that we release um frustrations and tough feelings, and when we read in front of our kids, we're not only modeling that love of reading, but also that this is a tool. This
Yeah.
is a tool that is helping me. It's a tool that you could use too.
Yeah. I like to say, read by example.
Yes. Yes. I think also so I read a lot on Audible because I'm
Mhm.
so busy. Um, but I always seem to be in the car, so I read a lot in the car with Audible. And I saw someone post on Instagram a few weeks ago. When you talk to someone about a book that you listen to on an audiobook, do you say that you read it, or do you say that you listened to it? And I thought, of course I say I read it, because that is reading. It's just a different way of reading. And it was kind of, I found it a little like, I don't like that of course it's reading. Why should we look at it any differently?
I know I see a lot of discourse online about, do audiobooks count as reading? And yes, they do. I don't do audiobooks just because I have a hard time paying attention to them. And I'm actually jealous of people who can listen to audiobooks because I feel like I would read so much more if I did. But I will like adamantly argue that audiobooks are reading.
Thank you.
100%.
I want to circle back to some of the other the other topics that you brought up.
Mhm.
At so you have talked about how your blog and then social media has sort of shifted as your life has evolved. So can you talk a little bit more about what your overall goal is for all that you share with your community?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a lot of what we talked about, which is just, getting families reading, encouraging reading. Pick up a book, whether you are a parent or not. I think anyone and everyone can read. That's what's beautiful about reading is books are accessible to everyone. There are libraries in every community. Go get a book and discover reading, discover a book, escape into a book. So, like I said, I primarily focus on the books I'm reading and the books my kids are reading or that I'm reading with my kids these days. But what it really boils down to is reading every day, reading as a family, having books accessible in our home. Um, and so it's just about promoting reading and a love of books, in whatever form that takes.
And such an important message, and I love the way that you talk about it and also the way that you share in such a joyful way. I think it's such a great model for our listeners, for families, and really for anybody who's sort of on this journey with you as part of your community and as a reader. So thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, I want my kids to love reading and to love books and it's, I've loved books since I was a little kid and I'm grateful my parents always made them accessible to us. I remember, we'd take um, trips to the local bookstore as a family periodically. And my parents and I know I say this from a place of privilege, but when we would go to a toy store, my parents would be like, well, save your allowance if you want that toy. um, but when we get into the bookstore, I remember like coming to them with a stack of books in my arm, and there was never a question of save your allowance. It was always just, okay, put it on the counter so I can pay for it. And I know that was, I was very privileged to come from a family where my parents could just buy me books when I wanted them. But it also made a really big impact on me. And there's nothing that says you can't go to the library and let your kid pick out a stack of books and check them out because it's free and they're accessible. And librarians are so wonderful and they're such a good resource. And I love being able to do that with my kids. We go to the library regularly. We live like a mile away from our local library, and we can go in there and find books and let them pick out whatever they want and bring them home with us. And when we can, we go to the local bookstore and pick out new books to bring home with us. And I love having a home filled with books. I love having kids who will pick out books to ask me to read to them, or that they will look at themselves. I mean, my kids are only 4. They don't know how to read yet, but they will quote unquote read to themselves all the time. My favorite thing my son does right now at bedtime is I'll ask him to pick a book for me to read when I tuck him in, and he'll pick out 2. He said, this one's for you, mommy, and this one's for me. And he will like
So
climb into his
sweet.
bed with the 2 books, and I will read one to him, and then he'll read one, quote unquote, to himself after I turn off the light and leave his room. And it's just like, this one's for you, and this one's for me, and I'm going to read this one to myself, and you read that one to me. And it's just like, I love that. I love
It's
that.
amazing. That's
And so,
amazing.
yeah, it is. And it's just, I love fostering that in them. I love them seeing me read. I've made a real deliberate point over the last couple of years to prioritize for myself physical books over ebooks, because they don't quite get that nuance of an e-reader, because for them it's just a device I'm looking at. And so I really prioritized physical books for myself, um, so that they see me reading a book.
Yes.
And it's leading by example, reading by example. And so they see me reading. My husband reads, maybe not as voracious to them every day. We have formal times throughout the day with one or both of them will just bring us a book and ask us to read it. And it's always a yes, because it takes what, 5 minutes to read a picture book to a kid. And it's such wonderful quality time together. And I just, that's not something I ever want to say no to if I don't have to. And there's books all over our house, and it's a beautiful, wonderful thing, and I love it. It makes me happy.
It sounds like you really are inspiring a love of reading in your family, in a way that's like really impactful and really tangible. Um, so it sounds like what you're doing is working. As
So I
we
think so.
as we begin to wind down, I just want to make sure that all of our listeners can find you online. So can you tell everybody where to find you?
Yeah, the best place is Instagram, and my handle is at novel.novice. And that's primarily where I hang out on the social media internet space these days. The blog technically still exists. It's novelnovice.com, but it's kind of a hot mess. But if you want to see archived book reviews, they're up there. But mostly it's Instagram. That's where I hang out these days.
Thank you so much for being with us today, Sara. I'd like to thank Familius for their support in bringing this podcast to your ears and your heart. We'd be thrilled if you subscribe to the podcast and left us a review. And when you're ready for that next amazing book adventure, we'd be honored if you choose a book from Familius. One step at a time, we can make the world a happier place.